All right, guys. So today we are going to go over a case series study. So we talked a little bit about case studies and their efficacy and value, but now we're going to think about case series, which are an extrapolation of a case study, but it's usually done with more than one person, where a case study in and of itself is done on a singular person. And why are they valuable? Why can they be valuable? Typically, case studies are done with individuals, athletes that are advanced lifters or advanced competitors. So that can give us some really good quantitative feedback pertaining to the athletes that we're probably training on a one-to-one scale, whereas research in and of itself is typically on untrained populations. And even when they are trained, it's a laughable thing to call them trained sometimes. So the idea is that this is going to give us just a more in-depth look at athletes that we may be training, but always understand that there's interindividuality with each person. So just because this works for said people doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to translate to working for your athletes. So it's just another way to get some more thoughts going, to ask better questions. And we're just going to kind of go through and pick out some of the things that were occurring on this study and kind of just go from there. So the study was on efficacy of daily one rep max training in well trained powerlifters and weightlifters, a case series. This was headed by Dr. Mike Zourdos from Florida Atlantic University. He is one of the lead, I would say, researchers in powerlifting, which is very cool to see. He has his own powerlifting lab in Boca Raton, and he does a lot of stuff with daily undulated periodization models in general. Um, so I think he's a good person. When he has studies coming up, he's also a competitive powerlifter, or he was a competitive powerlifter. So that also lends itself to him creating better studies and asking better questions than some people who've never competed or coached before. So, right off the bat, the abstract is: the purpose of this study was to investigate the efficacy of daily one rep max training on the back squat on maximal strength. Why is this important? Because sometimes you'll have studies that the purpose doesn't necessarily line up with the way their methods and their research models are pointed, meaning that they're setting up their research to prove their hypothesis, and instead of setting up their research to actually ask the better question, right? So this one states what his efficacy is. So then it's our job as researchers to look through the research and see if what they did actually answered the question, or did they set things up in a way to prove their point? Because that happens a lot within research nowadays, because research is becoming more of a business. And if you don't know, when you are a researcher, you are prone to sticking with the topic that you have found some competency in. So say, for instance, Dr. Campbell at USF, he is now the known as like the protein guy, right? And his research reflects protein studies. So he may hang his hat on these next 10 years, 15 years of being a protein guy, which means that in an ideal world, he would have the dissidence to be like, well, okay, well, maybe I was wrong. And now I can go back and recontemplate things. But a lot of researchers have egos. And if they put their foot in something for 10 years and they get proven wrong by the research, it's hard for them to back out. And that's what we see a lot with a lot of these older researchers, sticking to models that have been outdated and overdone, and also proven to be flawed in many ways. So those are some of the important things, is like understanding what the researcher is known for. Like Dr. Zourdos is known for DUP. So does he have bias towards DUP? Yes. Does he allow that bias to conjure up research that would support it? that's the questions that we have to ask, and that's our job as researchers to figure that out. So introduction here, the overarching training strategy for exercise performance optimization is based on the SAID principle, which is specific adaptations to impose demands. I think we can all agree with that. The more specific we can make our training to the sport, the better we're going to become at our given sport. It is recommended that resistance training of the same muscle group be performed 2 to 3 times per week with a 48-hour recovery period. Previous literature suggests that it is likely higher frequencies that are recommended for enhanced strength adaptation. And recent data has demonstrated a frequency of 3 days per week compared to 1 day per week to be superior for muscle hypertrophy. So when you read this, if you're getting light bulbs going off in your head, or you're getting something that just doesn't feel right, you just look at the reference numbers and you go and look at that research first to see if there's any flaws within that research, or if it's back, because there's a lot of research that will show, you know, higher frequency better, higher volume better, but then there's research that'll show moderate maybe better. Depends on if they're advanced, if they're intermediate. So some researchers can choose to leave out some things, and some researchers can choose to find research that supports their argument. So we always have to look at those things, and we always have to make sure that we're questioning what we read and not just taking it as a blanket statement. So the repeated bout effect is going to play a big role here. And that states when the same exercise or muscle group is repeated in training, there will be an attenuated myofiber damage effect, meaning that the more we train something similarly or consecutively, the less damage it's going to produce over time. That's why when we bring in a novel stimulus, we can get really sore. But then if we train that novel stimulus over and over again, we get less and less sore each time. So they hypothesized that despite daily strength fluctuations, squat 1 rep max would experience robust increases and be positively related to time of training over the 37-day period. So this research is done over 37 days. We'll kind of get into the intricacies of it right now. So participants, like I said, this will kind of give you an idea of who these studies may be relatable to and what we can extrapolate from that. So participant 1, 28 years old, participant 3, 34 years old, participant 2, 19 years old. Participant 1 and 3 had 10 years of training experience, while participant 2 had 5 years. Also understand participant 2 is USA weightlifting, and participant 1 and 3 is going to be USAPL. So 2 powerlifters, 1 Olympic weightlifter. And what they did here was they looked at total body mass, so how much they weighed, fat mass, and fat-free mass. And why this is important in terms of research, especially when you're doing this kind of research, is we want to see these numbers to be as kind of consistent as possible over time, right? So if participant 1 weighed in at 80.5 kilos, and then all of a sudden they weighed 84 kilos at the end of 30 days, that might be more indicative of why they gained strength than the actual training program. So we want to make sure these variables stay as consistent as possible. So that's why it's always important to get the nutrition that they're doing and making sure that it stays as consistent as we can get it. So most of their weight stayed relatively consistent throughout the entirety of the training. The 2 powerlifters both increased their weight about mid portion, and then it decreased back down by the end. You can see that almost all of them, besides the Olympic weightlifter, lost some fat mass, which kind of tells you maybe they had a little bit more fat mass to lose. And then fat-free mass, each one of them improved their fat-free mass indexes slightly as well, meaning that they added a little bit of muscle, they lost a little bit of fat, but their body weight stayed relatively the same. So good things, letting us know that the training program in and of itself is going to be a little bit more indicative of the results than their nutrition and other things. So this is kind of the breakdown of what they did. Each participant performed the back squat for 37 consecutive days, with a 1 rep max performed on 36 days of the 37. Throughout the days 1 through 30, participants performed a 1 rep max squat followed by 5 volume sets. The 5 volume sets consisted of either 5 sets of 3 repetitions at 85% or 5 sets of 2 repetitions at 90%. So this is all they did. Now, if you think that this is volume, you need to think about what volume actually is, right? So this is still not a lot of volume. It's a lot of work in higher rep ranges, but it's not indicative of a lot of volume that would be overly fatiguing to an athlete. So that's one thing to think about when trying to set up a training program like this, is that the volume is not high, but the amount of work is mentally fatiguing because it's such high intensities. But it's not central nervous fatigue, and it can be a little bit neurological fatigue, but it's going to be more peripheral within the muscles. So days 31 through 32, they performed 1 rep max followed by 3 volume sets. So this is kind of their tapering phase. Then next 2 days, 2 volume sets. And then the 35, 1 volume set. Day 36 was a lighter session before they maxed out on day 37 at 85% of their pre-training test 1 rep max. So to complete the study, the participants did a 1 rep max on day 37, no volume sets. Before each session, 360 milligrams of caffeine was consumed along with some branched chain amino acids, and post-workout 44 grams of whey was consumed. And the reason they do this within studies is just to control the variables. If they're not giving these athletes this stuff, the athletes may do that themselves, or they may not take post-workout nutrition seriously. So if they can just give them these things, at least these are quantifiable things that they know each person did exactly to the way that they wanted it to. And then each day, participants recorded a perceived recovery status. So they kind of just talked about how good, how recovered they feel. And that's something to think about. They did that upon entering the lab before caffeine ingestion. And again, 20 to 30 minutes following caffeine ingestion, immediately before the onset of training. So they were refrained from all additional exercise, except for they were allowed to do bench press and military press 2 to 3 times per week. And this is kind of what they prescribed to them as what they could do, because like you said, these are competitive lifters. So they wanted to make sure that they were able to keep their upper body training going as much as possible, but it was within these confounding limits. So testing, each 1 rep max attempt athletes, for each 1 rep max attempt, athletes, an IRI based RPE, which was used to attempt selection and gauge difficulty. That was a poorly worded sentence, or maybe I just can't read. For all other 1 rep max days, 2 through 35, a 1 rep max was determined when either the above conditions for days 1 through 37 were met. These are the above conditions, or the additional condition of a lift being reported as an RPE 9.5, or after the 3rd attempt of the day. So they either had 3 attempts or they had an RPE of 9.5. And then the investigator decided to cease the attempts during days 2 through 35, or after the third attempt was allowed. They just wanted to avoid failure. So they made sure that they were monitoring that as close as possible. And we know the research that as we get closer to failure, we predict RPEs a lot better. And then over time, we predict RPEs a lot better. So they got better and better at it as the time went on. And because it was closer to 1 rep max, they were better able to predict RPEs. So they looked at average velocity, they looked at Wilks, they looked at body composition, they looked at perceived recovery status. So all these variables are good to know. They looked at muscle thickness as well, which this one was an interesting one. We'll get to the results of all that in a second. And then they did a training questionnaire, statistical analysis, and they broke it up into quartiles, which is important too. We'll get to that so that you can see the trends. Trends are very important, not necessarily daily results, but how those daily results look on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis is very important, because we know as coaches, we have lifters who feel bad one day and all of a sudden they think that the world's coming to an end, their program sucks, and they're looking for another coach. And I'm sure everyone can relate to that as dealing with athletes. If it's not progress all the time, then it's a failure, which is not the greatest way to do things, in my opinion. So we're going to look here at the table, and then if you want, you can find the study and look at all the statistics within it. But sometimes that can be muddied and hard to understand, but these tables are perfect, right? So participant 1 and participant 3 were the powerlifters, trained over 10 years. Participant 2, weightlifter, trained for 5 years. So you can see these are in kilos, their start weights, 215 kilos, their midpoint, 222.5, post, 222, right? So you can see these improvements here to here, and then percentage of improvement, right? Participant 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of see that participant 1 made really good improvements the first half, and then kind of just plateaued the rest of the way until they did their peak. And then their peak, they added 7 kilos. So this person had a little bit of a delayed fatigue effect, whereas you can see here and here, they were able to kind of push through the entire time. And then their peak was almost the exact same as their post, where this person's peak improved by 5 kilos compared to their post. So interesting to see that these linear increases didn't necessarily result in a big, massive peak through their taper, but the person that had ups and downs and ended their post in a little bit more fatigue state had better results of their peak. So maybe being more fatigued will allow for a greater peak is something to think about, at least, right? But we're looking here at the older lifter. This person was in their mid 30s, training for over 10 years, started with a, 484 squat, added 21 kilos to their squat in 37 days, 45 to 47 pounds in 37 days. I don't know anyone who would not take that improvement, right? 12 kilo improvement here and a 13 kilo improvement here. Remember, guys, these are well-established lifters who have been training for a long time. They may not be the strongest people in the world, but they've been training for a very long time. So to have these type of improvements is significant. So we'll kind of get into some of that stuff. Going to the next table, and this is something that is very important for us as coaches to be able to showcase to lifters, right? We talked about each quartile. So they took the 37 days, broke it up into 4. Quartile 1, days 1 through 9, days 10 through 18, 19 through 27, and 28 through 35. Right? So we can see the ebbs and flows of each lifter. Good improvements. The younger lifter was able to improve consistently throughout the entirety of it. The older lifters had good improvements in the beginning, and then small drop-offs, and then back to improvements, right? So that's something to think about. As you are an advanced lifter, you may not have, and we know this, right? You may not have a linear increase in things, But just because it's not linearly increasing does not necessarily mean it's not working. We don't want to abandon ship. We want to think about adaptations. We want to think about recovery. We want to think about fatigue and how all those play a role, and how it's not so important to jump ship if you have things that are trending downwards. Now, if it's a consistent trend down and everything else is suffering, then we would start to look at the program. But just because you've had 1, 2, 3, 4 bad training sessions for a specific lift doesn't mean that that lift's not actually making progress. It may just mean that you're accumulating fatigue, and because you're training so consistently that you're not able to actually showcase the strength that you've developed, that maybe a deload is necessary to showcase that. And that's the importance of that fitness fatigue paradigm and their ability to register stress and be able to reduce that stress so that they're able to showcase what their true potential is. So as you can see here, all 36 days, you have ebbs and flows. Some days are good, some days are bad. If you're squatting every single day, not every day is going to be a win, right? And that could be so many factors. It could be sleep, it could be quality of sleep, it could be stress, it could be a ton of things that can limit you from actually making improvements. But if you see week 1 through 7 improvements, right? 7 through 14 improvements, it's all rising up. And then some more charts to kind of see everything. So these are kind of the discussions they talked about. A plausible explanation for the considerable strength increases in well-trained lifters is the resultant neuromuscular adaptations of ultra-specific training. So what's one thing that the research says a lot is that neural adaptations come from beginners, and that's how they get that extreme climb in results, which is true. But then they say after a certain period of time, neuromuscular adaptations start to diminish, and then hypertrophy is more important because hypertrophy over time will attenuate better strength gains. Well, this is telling you right here that even over 10 years of training in their upper 20s, mid 30s, that they're still getting really good neuromuscular adaptations. So it's not something that diminishes as robustly as they want you to believe in some of the research. So average velocities, this one was very interesting. Average velocities in the present study decreased from Q1 to Q4, and our results were consistent with previous literature in that average velocity at 1 rep max was inversely associated with training status. P1, highest Wilks coefficient, had the slowest mean average velocity over all 36 1 rep max training days. So the strongest person, the best Wilks, had the slowest average velocity. And the next highest had the second slowest. So the stronger you are, typically the slower the bar speed is going to be. And that's indicative of neuromuscular adaptations occurring, right? And also understanding that the slower you move, the more force you can produce. And the slower you move, the more control you're going to have over your position, over your bracing, right? But it comes to a certain extent, right? You can't go so slow because you're going to eventually pass out and run out of oxygen. But you don't want to go so fast that you're not able to maintain force production, not able to maintain tightness. So something to consider with your athletes as you're watching their videos and their bar speed, correlating that to whether or not they're able to maintain tightness and force production. We got to think about these things. We're always trying to think about, can we need to move the bar faster, which is important, but to what extent is it important? What are we robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak, right? So regarding the hypertrophy findings were inconsistent as all 3 participants experienced a positive percentage change from day 1 to day 37 at 2 sites, but we also observed a decline at 1 site, meaning that maybe this hypertrophy thing, attenuating strength over time, is not as important as we think it is, right? And that's something that I have been preaching recently based on the research that I'm finding. Hypertrophy is important. It can help get you stronger, it can help make you more resilient, but it shouldn't be the forefront of your training paradigm to get stronger. You shouldn't be in a hypertrophy phase if it doesn't correlate to actually making you stronger. For example, I have been training for 12 years. I competed in 242 my entire powerlifting career. I did not necessarily get any bigger muscularly, but I went from a 1,600 pound total to a 2,000 pound total. And I was taking a bunch of drugs to try to get as strong as humanly possible and to get as big as humanly possible. And I still was not able to get that much bigger, but I was able to get a lot stronger. So always things to consider: where you're spending your time within a training paradigm and how valuable is that going to be to long-term success. So it seems likely that neural factors and skill adaptation, aka skill acquisition, technical efficiency of the squat played the predominant role in enhancing one rep max strength in the present investigation due to specificity. Skill adaptation, neural factors. What does that mean? Practice your lifts as much as you can. Interestingly, neither pre-training scores, these are the scores of how they felt, nor 80%, 85% average velocity were consistently related to performance. How you feel is not always going to be indicative of how well you perform. Therefore, pre-training self-perceived recovery may not be as strong of a performance indicator compared to RPE or reps in reserve after the onset of training. Thus, if determining daily training load based upon athlete feedback, it may be most appropriate to make decisions once the warm-up period has started rather than beforehand. Meaning that we've been to the gym several times, we felt like shit, but then as soon as we start warming up, everything kind of felt pretty good and we were able to still make really good progress. But if we were to base our training on how we got out of the car and how we felt going into the gym, that could have diminished. So we want to at least give ourselves every opportunity to feel good before reducing the actual training load. So conclusions: it is unlikely this type of training can nor should be maintained year round, and rather be more appropriate as a slight or as a single intensity block to peak for a competition within a macro cycle. So I agree, right? You can't train a one rep max year round every single day, because then you're not going to be able to drive adaptations with other exercises. We didn't see what their bench press did. We didn't see what their deadlift did. But let's just say they did a one rep max for 35 days. If we do a one rep max once a week for 35 weeks, could we potentially get the same benefits that they got within their program? Or if we did it twice a week, and then that would give us right around 17 and a half weeks. Would you take a 20 kilo training for 10 years? Would you take a 20 kilo jump in squats in 17 weeks? I mean, I most definitely do that. So yes, this may not be indicative of a training paradigm, but it does show us that, hey, maybe specificity is the biggest driving factor in neuroadaptation. I'm going to practice the lift. I'm going to get better at the lift. I'm going to get really strong at the lift, but I know I can't do it every day. So how can I incorporate a program that allows me to do it as often as possible? If you're doing a single only during your peak block, that's not going to be as conducive as doing it multiple times throughout the year. Something to think about, guys, something to wrap your mind around, the idea of variation being so important, and then also shitty exercise selection, thinking that specificity is going to create injuries over time. It's like, yeah, if you just squatted, if you just did if you did 10 sets a day of squats and you didn't change anything, yeah, squats would eventually beat you up. But if you did 10 sets of anything every day and didn't do anything else, then you would get beat up, right? So it's like, well, what exercises can we pick to complement the squats so that we can squat as often as possible without getting beat up? That's the that's the question that I would start to try to answer for my athletes, rather than which bars can I use to allow my athletes some reprieve from a low bar squat. Now, I'll have athletes that are like, hey, man, I'm tired of low bar squatting. And, they're just your intermediate run of the mill athletes that just like to have fun. It's like, cool, let's switch it up, right? Because if the athlete's unmotivated to go train, then that's going to be a problem for adherent purposes and for focus and cognitive purposes as well. So, in an ideal world, competition lives year round. When you have someone that's dedicated to being the best, they can buy into that without getting burnt out. Other people, they might get burnt out. So then we have to figure out exercises that complement it as much as we can to make sure that the athlete's having fun, staying focused and motivated, but we're also still getting the work that we can get and get improvements. Because that athlete that's telling you that they don't want to get burnt out and they just want to have a little bit of fun in training, when it comes back to getting ready for a meet, they're going to be very concerned with where their numbers are, but they weren't thinking about that 14, 20 weeks ago when they were quote unquote burnt out. So we just always want to think about those things, right? We want to be athlete-centered communicators so that we can build a program that the athletes kind of telling us to build, but understanding that we can still get the most out of the program, even though we're trying to make the athlete happy. So hope that you found this useful. The research tells you a lot, guys, but it doesn't tell you everything. Research along with application and knowledge under the bar can make very dangerous and very good coaches. So please do your due diligence on reading the research and then get under the bar and put it to use and see what happens. If you guys have any questions about the research or anything else, feel free to ask below. If you guys have any questions about specificity and how to put that into a training cycle, definitely ask those below. And I hope you guys have a great week.